in as much detail as I can in the short time available, because although, quite rightly, all our attention and pretty much all our campaigning is now focused on trying to stop the unfolding barbarity in Gaza, it is not the only thing that the imperialists are busy doing. Israel is certainly important to the imperial powers. Joe Biden said it's the best $3 billion that the US ever spends, and if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And it is entirely a product and function of the rule of imperial power in the Middle East. In fact, if we had to describe in brief how the major powers, the United States and their allies, keep order in the Middle East, we could put it like this: that the United States and its allies pay Israel to keep the Palestinians, and by extension all Arabs, down, and they pay the dictatorships and authoritarian regimes of the Middle East to stop them from attacking Israel. That is how the original scheme was developed when Balfour promised the Zionist Palestine, and when at the same time Lawrence of Arabia and his senior officers appointed the same land to the Arabs, mostly actually the Arabs who came to be Saudi Arabia's ruling class. But it's not the only thing that the imperialists are about, and colonialism isn't the only damage that the imperial system does to the world. And we have to look no further than the war in the Ukraine to see that. 500,000, 500,000 now dead in the war in the Ukraine. And that should remind us of this, that the imperial powers are not just willing to sacrifice people in the colonial and neo-colonial world. When it suits their purpose, they will throw into the meat grinder as easily working people from their own economies to fight working people from other, often advanced economies as well. And the meat grinder in the Ukraine recalls to us the meat grinder of the First World War, when that was exactly what happened. And I said at the Gaza demonstration, the great big demonstration in Birmingham recently, that it was Boris Johnson who said, "Let the bodies pile high." Now, he wasn't talking about Palestinians, although he might have been. He was talking about us during the COVID pandemic, and they would as easily sacrifice us in a war as they would in a pandemic. And they are heading towards one. Let's have a look at this. This is global military expenditure over the last 20 years, and you can see that it's nearly doubled, and that it is rising in recent years faster than ever. And you might want to bear that in mind when you hear the speech from Grant Shapps. It was a watershed speech at Lancaster House, where he said, "We are not in a post-war world, but in a pre-war world." That the leaders of the Tory party and the British military forces are now advocating fairly strongly for the return of conscription, where Grant Shapps is already officially talking about defence expenditure at a record 2.5% of GDP, and unofficially in his private speeches of an even larger 3% defence expenditure. This is in a world where the United States is still by far the biggest military spender in the world, but in which Britain is disproportionately represented in that table, as you see. But even more frighteningly, this is where the increases in military expenditure are coming. And in a way, it's the Trump policy of shifting the burden, long-standing US policy, but most violently expressed by Donald Trump, of shifting the burden of defence expenditure on to NATO allies. As you see, the United States increase in defence expenditure is a relatively modest 2-point-something%. Britain is at nearly 10%, and some of the European countries are in the 40% bracket. That is another indication that the major imperialists are moving towards a war economy, and the thing that happens with war economies is that they actually get used in wars. The good news is that they aren't really convincing the rest of us. Here's a very recent YouGov poll which asked people, if there was a new world war, would you be willing to serve? And the biggest single section of respondents say, I would not volunteer and would refuse to serve if called up. It's a fairly, I think, powerful compliment to the anti-war movement over the last 20 years in this country. The biggest section of the population just are essentially saying, and I put it up there, the old Vietnam draft dodgers slogan, hell no, we won't go. Perhaps even more scary for the establishment is the subsequent question, which YouGov asked, which was, if the country was about to be invaded, would you be willing to serve? And still, the single biggest number of people, even apparently if Putin's regiments were massed at Dunkirk, is I would not volunteer, I would refuse to serve if called up. Now, I actually don't believe that poll. I think if the war propaganda got going and there was a foreign enemy in Dunkirk, that the poll would end out differently. I read this as an even more extreme version of the previous graph, which is saying we don't like the militarism, we don't like the increase in arms expenditure, we don't like the wars that have been so disastrously prosecuted in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now in backing Israel in Gaza, and we don't want any part of the growing militarism in the society. And here's probably why, or one reason why they don't like it. Now, we've just learned that the economy was in recession, technically in recession at the end of last year. But if you took not the overall GDP figures, but GDP per head, then you can see that people have been having a recession for a lot longer than that. And you might argue that there's been a permanent recession in this country since the banking crisis. So there, in many ways, is the shape of the argument about the new militarism in this country. A concerted attempt by the Tory party, the heads of the armed forces, to reboot British militarism, and a deep and profound scepticism across very large chunks of the society about anything like that. And I think this is one of the backgrounds to the enormous well of support that's been drawn on in opposition to the Israeli support in Gaza. We have lived through, as a generation, a series of absolutely disastrous foreign policy decisions by our government. In Afghanistan, to fight a war over more than a decade, 15 years, and to end up with exactly the same Taliban government in power as you were at the beginning, and a war, by the way, which is little talked about, where the British in Helmand had to be rescued by their American compatriots. A war in Iraq, which has turned Iraq from what was a Western ally into an Iranian ally, and in which, during the course of that war, the British in Basra had to be rescued by their American allies. A disastrous air war campaign in Libya, which turned whatever the defects of the Gaddafi regime, a stable regime, into an absolutely disastrous societal mess, which is not what was supposed to be written on that tin, and now losing at an absolutely huge scale public opinion over the question of Gaza. The YouGov poll, which wasn't the best poll on this, by the way, but the YouGov poll between the November last year and February this year has seen a 7% increase to 66% of people in this country who want a ceasefire in Gaza. Only 13% of the population in this country support the Israeli policy of continuing a military offensive. They've won the political establishment, but they've lost the mass opinion, not just of demonstrators, but the mass opinion across the entire society. Now, we had a discussion earlier about whether more needs to be done. It does. But that is the basis for thinking that we can build industrial action, that we can build school student strikes. Many of schools have already taken action, that we can sink deeper roots than even this mass movement into the society. Because I think working people in this country have a profound sense of solidarity with Palestinians because they don't like bullies. They don't like seeing people, innocent people, being gunned down by the most sophisticated weapons in the world. They have a small feeling that what is done to the Palestinians is the kind of thing that's done to them. That the kind of ruling class that doesn't care about dead Palestinians doesn't care about dead people in this country during the COVID pandemic. That they have as little care, the rich and the powerful have as little care for the lives of Palestinians as they have for working people in this country. And we have every interest in pushing that argument home as far as it will possibly go. And saying, because I think that many people, many Palestinians tell me this, many people I worked with in Egypt, I was in Egypt for 9 out of the 18 days in Tahrir Square in the revolution that brought down Mubarak. And many of my friends tell me across the Middle East that they look towards the demonstrations in London. Mustafa Barghouti told Jeremy Corbyn, we look to London because the demonstrations are so big and so radical. So we must live up to that expectation and at the same time say to people in the Middle East, so my friends in Egypt, to our allies in Lebanon, to the people resisting in the Yemen, now is the time to step up the resistance. We will do everything that we can to step up the resistance, but now is the time not to fail the Palestinians, to understand that the wider imperial project will engage us in more and even bloodier wars than this, and we must break it in one of its essential homelands, and that is in this country.